The antique silver necklace rested in the dusty display of the small antique shop, its oval locket etched with intricate details that held an untold story. To Thomas Bennett, the piece was far more than just a piece of jewelry. It was the last tangible memory of his wife, Sarah, who had passed away 2 years ago in a tragic car accident. The 45-year-old businessman frequently walked past the shop, his gaze invariably drawn to the soft gleam of the aged metal. Emma Parker, 28, was carefully arranging items in the display when she once again noticed the man in the dark suit who always stopped to look at the necklace. She had started working at the shop just 3 months ago, after being let go from her executive position at a major tech company. What was meant to be a temporary job had become an unexpected refuge as she worked to untangle the mysteries of her own past. On that crisp autumn morning, dried leaves danced along the sidewalk as Thomas finally summoned the courage to step inside the shop. The soft chime of the doorbell announced his presence. Emma watched as he hesitantly approached the display case, his hands slightly trembling as he pointed toward the necklace. "May I see that necklace, please?" His voice sounded rougher than he had intended. Emma carefully removed the piece from the display, noticing the way Thomas's eyes lit up with a mix of pain and wonder. When she placed the necklace in his hands, he held it as though it were made of the most delicate crystal. "It's identical," he murmured, more to himself than to Emma. "Every detail, every curve, it's exactly like hers." Emma felt the weight of the story behind those words. Years of working in the corporate world had taught her to read people, and there was something profoundly moving about the way this man held the necklace. "It's a unique piece," she said softly. "An elderly woman brought it in a few months ago. She said it had been in her family for generations." Thomas looked up, startled. "Do you know her name? The woman who brought it in?" Emma shook her head. "I'm sorry, it was before I started working here. But I can check the store records if you'd like." As Emma headed to the small office in the back, Thomas continued to examine the necklace, his fingers tracing the familiar patterns on the metal. Each touch seemed to bring back memories of Sarah, her smile, her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when she was happy. Emma returned a few minutes later, flipping through an old ledger. "I found something interesting," she said, approaching the counter. "The necklace was brought in by a woman named Margaret Wilson. She left a phone number, but—" Thomas turned pale at the mention of the name, and the necklace almost slipped from his trembling hands. "Margaret Wilson?" he repeated, his voice barely more than a whisper. That's not possible. Do you know her?" Emma asked, intrigued by his reaction. "Margaret Wilson was Sarah's mother, my wife's mother," Thomas replied, his voice laden with emotion. "But she passed away more than 5 years ago, long before Sarah?" A chill ran down Emma's spine. Something about the story didn't add up. "Are you certain? This record says she brought the necklace in just 4 months ago." Thomas carefully placed the necklace back on the counter, his mind racing to process the impossible revelation. "I personally arranged her funeral. Sarah was devastated, she was an only child. How could she have brought the necklace?" Emma looked more closely at the ledger, her eyes landing on a detail she hadn't noticed before. There was an address written beside Margaret's name, in handwriting that didn't match the rest of the entry. "There's an address here," she said, showing the notebook to Thomas. "Maybe we can find out more about how the necklace ended up at the shop." Thomas read the address and felt his heart begin to pound. It was in an old neighborhood in the city, not far from where they were. But what unsettled him the most was recognizing the handwriting. It was identical to Sarah's. "This handwriting?" he murmured, running his fingers over the written words. "It's Sarah's handwriting. But how? Why?" Emma realized she was witnessing something far more significant than a simple transaction in an antique shop. As someone who had always sought answers about her own past, having been adopted as a baby and possessing only an old newspaper clipping as a clue to her origins, she understood the weight of this moment. "Mr. Bennett," Emma said, making a sudden decision, "my shift ends in an hour. If you'd like, I can go with you to that address. Something tells me there's more to this story than meets the eye." Thomas hesitated for a moment, glancing from the necklace to Emma and back to the address in the notebook. The idea of investigating this mystery both frightened and intrigued him. After 2 years spent in the limbo of grief and loneliness, this was the first time he felt a flicker of something. Oh, fear. He couldn't tell. "Why would you do that?" he asked, studying Emma's youthful but resolute expression. Emma gave him a soft smile as she carefully placed the necklace into a small velvet box. "Because sometimes we need help to face our mysteries. And something about this necklace feels like more than just a coincidence." At that moment, neither of them could have known how this decision would forever change their lives. The necklace, with its secrets etched into the old silver, was about to unveil a story that would intertwine the past and present in ways neither could have imagined. An hour later, Emma locked up the shop and found Thomas waiting on the sidewalk. The autumn sky was beginning to darken, and a cool breeze carried the scent of rain. As they walked toward the mysterious address, Emma clutched her bag tightly, the small box with the necklace tucked inside. It felt as though she was carrying more than just a piece of jewelry, it was the weight of a mystery ready to unfold. What would they find at that address? How could Sarah's deceased mother have left the necklace at the shop? And why was Sarah's handwriting in the store's record, 2 years after her death? The answers to these questions were about to shake the very foundation of everything Thomas thought he knew about his wife and his past. The first twist in their story was just beginning, and neither Thomas nor Emma could have imagined how their lives would become entwined by the secrets locked within that antique silver necklace. The address led them to an old red brick building in the heart of the historic district. Its well-preserved facade stood out elegantly against the surrounding glass and steel skyscrapers. The building's Art Deco architecture evoked a more refined era, with intricate ornaments and arched windows that reflected the amber hues of the autumn sky. Thomas adjusted his tie for the third time since they left the shop, a nervous habit Emma had already noticed. She could feel the tension radiating from him as they stepped through the marble-floored lobby. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly, drawing the curious gaze of an elderly doorman who peered at them over his reading glasses but chose not to ask questions. "Apartment 502, Emma confirmed, glancing at the notebook again as they entered the vintage Art Deco elevator. Its mirrored walls reflected their anxious expressions, multiplying the uncertainty they both carried. The distant strains of classical piano music floated faintly through the elevator shaft, adding a cinematic quality to their improbable mission. "Sarah never mentioned this place," Thomas broke the silence, his voice tinged with a mix of anxiety and confusion. "In the 15 years we were married, she shared so many stories with me, but never once about an apartment at this address. How could there be so many secrets I didn't know?" Emma glanced at his reflection in the mirror, a man who appeared successful and composed in his professional life, now looking utterly adrift. Every new discovery seemed to redraw the map of his memories, leaving him grappling with a past he no longer recognized. The elevator came to a smooth halt on the 5th floor. The corridor was a portrait of old-world elegance, with bronze sconces casting a warm golden glow over dark green wallpaper patterned with swirling Art Nouveau designs. Their footsteps were muffled by a Persian carpet as they made their way to apartment 502, the air tinged with a faint scent of lavender and aged wood. When they finally found the door, Emma noticed Thomas's hands trembling slightly. He hesitated in front of the old brass doorbell, his fingers hovering over the button for several seconds before finally pressing it. The melodic chime echoed from the other side, followed by the soft shuffle of approaching footsteps. The door opened, revealing a woman of about 70 years old, an elegant presence with gray hair perfectly styled in a low bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. She wore a navy blue skirt suit that exuded timeless dignity. "May I help you?" she asked in a polite voice tinged with the remnants of an old high society accent. Emma noticed Thomas seemed to have lost the ability to speak, so she took the lead. "Good evening," she began, maintaining the professional tone she had perfected during her years in the corporate world. "We're looking for information about Margaret Wilson. She left a necklace in our antique shop a few months ago, and this was the address we had on file." The woman studied them for a moment, her piercing blue eyes taking in every detail. Then, something shifted in her gaze, a flicker of recognition quickly masked by a look of polite curiosity. "Ah yes. Margaret," she said, each word deliberately chosen. "She lived in this apartment for over 40 years. I'm Elizabeth Parker, the current owner. I purchased the apartment from her estate about 5 years ago." Thomas finally found his voice, stepping forward. The movement brought his face into the light of the hallway, and for a moment, something flickered in Elizabeth's eyes, as if she had seen a ghost. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice rough with restrained emotion, "I'm Thomas Bennett. Margaret was my mother-in-law, and I am absolutely certain she passed away 5 years ago. I arranged the funeral myself. How could she have left a necklace in the shop just a few months ago?" Elizabeth studied them for a long moment, her gaze shifting between the two visitors with an intensity that made Emma wonder if she was deciding how much to reveal. Finally she opened the door wider. "I believe you should come in," she said softly. "There's something you need to see." The apartment was a living testament to a more refined era. Antique dark wood furniture, Persian rugs faded with time, and heavy silk curtains framed the tall windows. Silver-framed photographs occupied nearly every available surface, black and white faces silently observing the visitors. Elizabeth led them down a hallway adorned with floral wallpaper into a small library that seemed plucked straight out of a period film. Floor-to-ceiling shelves housed an impressive collection of leather-bound books, their gilded titles softly glowing under the light of an antique lamp. When I purchased the apartment, Elizabeth began, moving toward a magnificently preserved Chippendale desk, I found several boxes filled with Margaret's personal belongings and documents. At the time, I tried to locate her family, but all my efforts were unsuccessful. Her elegant fingers, marked by time yet still graceful, opened a carved drawer and retrieved a yellowed envelope. The paper looked fragile, as if it might crumble at the slightest touch. Among the documents I found this, she continued, her voice dropping to an almost whisper. They are letters Margaret wrote to Sarah but never sent. And also, she paused significantly, her eyes meeting Thomas's, I found a journal. Thomas had to steady himself against a nearby leather armchair, his legs seeming unable to hold him. Emma instinctively stepped closer to him, offering silent support. The air in the library seemed heavier, laden with the weight of secrets on the verge of being unveiled. In the journal, Elizabeth continued, her voice gentle but resolute, Margaret wrote about secrets she kept for decades. Secrets about Sarah, the family, and the necklace. Emma opened her bag and retrieved the black velvet box, presenting the necklace to Elizabeth. The elderly woman took the piece in hands that, despite her age, did not tremble. Her eyes sparkled with a recognition that went beyond mere familiarity with the object. Yes, she said softly, this is the necklace. Margaret devoted many pages to it. This jewelry isn't just a family heirloom, it carries a tragic story, intertwined with a traumatic event from Sarah's past, something that happened when she was very young. Thomas looked up, his face a mask of confusion and pain. What event? Sarah and I had no secrets, or at least I thought we didn't. Elizabeth let out a deep sigh, her hands now turning the yellowed pages of the journal with reverence. According to Margaret's writings, when Sarah was just 5 years old, she witnessed something no child should ever see. Something related to her father's death. The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Thomas shook his head in denial. No, that can't be right. Sarah told me her father died in a car accident when she was very young. She barely remembered him. It wasn't an accident, Elizabeth said, her voice now laden with an ancient sadness. According to Margaret, Sarah's father was murdered. And this necklace. This necklace was the only piece of evidence that could reveal the identity of the killer. Emma, who had been examining the necklace more closely under the lamplight, noticed something she had missed before, a faint inscription on the back of the oval locket. There's something engraved here, she said, tilting the piece to catch the light better. It looks like a date and initials? Thomas stepped closer, his face growing even paler as he saw the inscription. The date read March 15, 1985, and the initials were RP. RP, he murmured, his voice trembling. What does it mean? Robert Parker, Elizabeth completed, letting the journal fall onto the desk, her hands now visibly trembling. Robert Parker was my brother. The distant sound of a siren cut through the night air, a reminder of the outside world that felt so far removed from the secret-laden library. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine as the implications of that revelation hit her. The past and present were intertwining in ways none of them could have predicted, and the secrets kept for decades were on the verge of coming to light with unpredictable consequences. Thomas looked down at the necklace in his hands, then at Elizabeth and finally at Emma, realizing that they were only beginning to unravel a much more complex and darker plot than any of them could have imagined. The mystery of the necklace was only just starting to unfold, and with it, truths that would forever change the course of their lives. The silence in the library seemed to vibrate with the weight of the revelation. Elizabeth Parker sank heavily into an old armchair, her hands still trembling slightly. Margaret's journal lay open on the desk, its yellowed pages holding even more secrets yet to be revealed. Robert was my older brother, Elizabeth began, her voice laden with emotions long held back. He was a brilliant man, charming, and deeply troubled. He worked with Sarah's father at the old chemical company, Wilson and Associates. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Elizabeth. The chemical company? Sarah never mentioned that. She always said her father was an accountant. James Wilson was much more than an accountant, Elizabeth replied, reaching for an old framed photograph from a nearby shelf. He was a brilliant chemist, specializing in the development of new medications. And he was about to make a revolutionary discovery when her voice faltered, and Emma noticed how tightly her hands gripped the frame. The photograph showed two smiling men in white lab coats, posing in front of a laboratory. "When he was murdered," Thomas added softly. Elizabeth nodded. According to Margaret's journal, James discovered something terrible happening in the labs after hours. Robert was conducting unauthorized experiments, dangerous tests. Emma, who had been examining the photograph over Elizabeth's shoulder, furrowed her brow. "Wait a second," she said, reaching for her bag. After a few seconds of searching, she pulled out a folded, yellowed newspaper clipping. "This can't be a coincidence." Thomas and Elizabeth watched as Emma carefully unfolded the clipping. It was an old news article, dated March 1985, with a partially faded headline, "Tragedy at Pharmaceutical Lab, 2 Dead in Chemical Accident." "This clipping," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly, "was found with me when I was abandoned in an orphanage. It was the only clue about my past." The sharp sound of something breaking sliced through the air. Elizabeth had dropped the photograph, the glass frame shattering on the floor. Her face was as pale as paper. "My God," she whispered, her wide eyes fixed on Emma. You're Claire's daughter?" "Claire?" Emma asked, her heart racing. "Who is Claire?" Elizabeth struggled to her feet and walked slowly to an old cabinet in the corner of the library. With trembling hands, she opened a drawer and pulled out another envelope, even more yellowed than the first. "Claire was James Wilson's lab assistant," she explained, pulling more photographs from the envelope. "She was working late that night, helping James document his discoveries. She was 8 months pregnant." Emma felt the world spin around her. Thomas quickly brought a chair closer and she sat down, her legs unable to support her. "The newspaper reported 2 deaths," Elizabeth continued, her voice now almost a whisper. "James Wilson and my brother Robert. But there was a third person in the lab that night. Claire survived long enough to give birth, but—" "No," Emma interrupted, tears starting to form in her eyes. I can't be." Elizabeth gently placed a photograph in Emma's trembling hands. It showed a beautiful young woman with the same green eyes as Emma's, smiling at the camera as she cradled a pregnant belly. "Claire discovered what Robert was doing," Elizabeth continued. "She and James were gathering evidence to expose him. The necklace contained a microfilm with all the proof of the illegal experiments. Robert found out and killed them," Thomas finished, his voice horrified. "But how does Sarah fit into all of this?" Elizabeth picked up the journal again. "Sarah was in the lab that night. Margaret had left her with James because she needed to work late. The girl hid when she heard the argument start and she saw everything." Emma could barely breathe, her hands clutching the photograph of her mother. "But why did no one ever look for me? Why was I abandoned in an orphanage?" "To protect you," Elizabeth answered, tears now freely streaming down her face. "Margaret wrote that powerful people were involved in Robert's experiments. She feared they might try to silence any connection to the incident. So, with the help of a nurse, she made sure you were taken away to a safe place." Thomas, who had been silent, absorbing all the revelations, suddenly stood up. "Sarah's accident, 2 years ago, it wasn't an accident, was it?" Elizabeth closed her eyes, the pain evident on her face. "No." According to the journal, Sarah started to remember. The childhood trauma which had been buried for so long began to surface. She found the necklace among her mother's old things and someone found out she knew, Thomas finished, his voice choking. "Someone killed her to keep the secret." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stared at the photograph of her mother, trying to process how her search for an old necklace had not only revealed her origins but also a web of conspiracy and death that spanned decades. "There's more," Elizabeth finally said, flipping through some pages of the journal. "Margaret wrote about a man, someone who was financing Robert's experiments. Someone who's still alive and has a lot to lose if the truth comes out." Thomas picked up the necklace from the table, examining it closely. "Is the microfilm still here?" Elizabeth shook her head. "No. Margaret wrote that she removed it and hid it elsewhere. A place only Sarah knew." Emma lifted her eyes from the photograph, a new determination emerging in her gaze through her tears. "Then we need to find it. Not just for what they did to Sarah but for my mother, for James Wilson. For everyone who died to keep this secret." Thomas nodded slowly, a new resolve now visible on his face. "Yes, but we need to be careful. If Sarah was killed for getting close to the truth..." The shrill sound of Elizabeth's phone cut through the air, making them all jump. She answered with trembling hands, listened for a moment and then paled. "Someone broke into my office at the university," she said after hanging up. All the old files I kept on the case. They were stolen? The three of them exchanged glances, the realization hitting them like a punch. They were no longer alone in their search for the truth. Someone else knew they were investigating the past, and that someone was willing to do anything to keep the secrets buried. The mystery of the necklace had just become much more dangerous, and there was no turning back now. Emma and Thomas were about to discover that some secrets come at a deadly price, and that the past never truly stays buried. The news of the break-in at Elizabeth's office triggered a wave of urgency among the three of them. The dusk sky was already painted in shades of purple when they decided it was no longer safe to stay in the apartment. Elizabeth quickly gathered Margaret's journal and some photographs into an old leather folder, her experienced hands moving with precision despite the subtle tremor that gripped them. Thomas alternated his gaze between the window and the street below, watching every movement with renewed attention. Years of experience in business had taught him to trust his instincts, and now they were screaming danger. Emma, by his side, kept a vigilant watch as well, her green eyes, so similar to her mother's in the photograph, scanning the growing shadows. "I know a place where we can talk safely," Thomas finally said, his voice low and controlled, though Emma could sense the underlying tension. "I have an old office in the basement of one of my commercial buildings. No one knows I still keep the space. After Sarah?" He hesitated, swallowing hard. "After the accident, I started keeping some places safe. Something inside me knew one day they'd be needed." The drive to the car was a surreal experience. The usually quiet, upscale neighborhood now felt hostile. The shadows cast by the streetlights created distorted shapes on the pavement, and every noise, the distant bark of a dog, the sound of a trash can knocked over by a street cat, made their hearts jump. Emma held the folder with the documents close to her chest, feeling the weight of the history they carried. Elizabeth walked between them, her upright and dignified posture contrasting with the tense situation. For a woman who had just had her world turned upside down, she showed remarkable strength. Thomas's car, a discreet sedan that didn't draw attention, was parked 2 blocks away. The walk seemed to last an eternity. When they finally got into the vehicle, the relief was momentary. They still had a long way to go. Thomas drove for about 20 minutes, making several unnecessary turns to ensure they weren't being followed. The building he chose as their refuge stood in a partially abandoned commercial area, a silent testament to the economic recession that had hit that part of the city. The secret office turned out to be a modest but surprisingly well-equipped space, hidden in the back of an apparently abandoned building. A single fluorescent light illuminated the room, casting a play of light and shadows that seemed fitting for the revelations to come. An old metal desk dominated the center of the space, surrounded by dusty files and office equipment that seemed frozen in time. "I started using this place right after," Thomas explained as he closed and locked the heavy door behind them. The metallic sound of the latch sliding echoed through the confined space. Something about Sarah's accident never felt right. The police classified it as a mechanical failure in the car, but... He shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. "I spent months investigating on my own. I hired private investigators, accident specialists. I could never prove anything concrete, but my gut kept telling me there was more to the story." Elizabeth began spreading the contents of the folder on the metal table. Margaret's journal, with its yellowed pages and elegant handwriting, seemed out of place in such an austere setting. The old photographs, capturing moments of a life that had ended so tragically, told their own silent story. Emma placed her precious newspaper clipping next to the other documents, completing that grim puzzle. Margaret mentioned several times in the last months of the journal that Sarah was having flashbacks, Elizabeth said, her wrinkled fingers delicately moving over the fragile pages. "It started a few months before her death. Nightmares at first, then more vivid memories. She was seeing a therapist? Dr. Michael Anderson," Thomas added, causing visible surprise in both women. "I found the receipts for her sessions when I was organizing her belongings. I tried to talk to him, of course. I went to his office several times, but he flatly refused to discuss the case. Medical confidentiality, he said. Even after I explained my suspicions about the accident." Emma, who had been carefully studying the old photographs, suddenly straightened in her chair. "Wait a minute," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the excitement of the discovery. "That name. Anderson. He's here." Her finger pointed to a handwritten note on the back of one of the lab photos. "M. Anderson, research assistant, 1985. Thomas practically jumped out of his chair, leaning over the photograph. His eyes widened in recognition. "My God, it's him. Younger of course, but it's definitely the same man." The same face shape, the same gaze. He worked at the lab? Elizabeth asked, her normally steady voice betraying a tremor of concern. Why would Sarah seek him out as a therapist of all the professionals in the city? Maybe she didn't know at first, Emma suggested, her analytical mind, an inheritance from years of solving complex problems, working quickly. Or maybe she discovered it during the sessions. If she started to remember, if the memories were coming back. He could have been monitoring her the whole time, Thomas concluded, his voice heavy with cold, controlled anger. All these years, and the man I thought could help us uncover the truth was actually protecting the guilty? Elizabeth began frantically searching through the pages of the journal, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the yellowed pages. There's something here, an entry that mentions a safe deposit box. Sarah had found something important, and stored it in a bank safe deposit box. Sarah kept a safe deposit box at the central bank, Thomas said, running his hands through his gray hair in a gesture of frustration. I tried to access it after her death, but they told me it had been emptied a week before the accident. At the time I thought she did it herself, that maybe... His voice faltered for a moment. Maybe she was planning to leave me. It didn't make sense, but I was so lost, so confused. Emma suddenly stood up, an idea taking shape in her mind. The microfilm of the necklace. What if Margaret wasn't the one who removed it as we thought? What if it was Sarah? If she started recovering her memories, she might have recognized the necklace when she found it among her mother's belongings. And kept the evidence in the safe, Thomas added, understanding dawning on his weary face. But then how did the necklace end up in the antique shop? Elizabeth kept flipping through the journal, then stopped suddenly, her face growing even paler. Here, oh my God. She began reading aloud, her voice trembling. Sarah came to see me today. She knows everything. She said she found proof that we can finally do justice. But she's scared. She said I need to keep the necklace, that it's important to keep up appearances while she prepares the documentation. Was that the last entry? Emma asked softly, already fearing the answer. Elizabeth nodded slowly. The next page was torn out. And a week later, Sarah was dead, Thomas finished, his voice choked with emotion. The heavy silence that followed was abruptly broken by the distant sound of a door slamming somewhere in the building. The three of them froze instantly, exchanging alarmed glances. This building should be completely empty, Thomas whispered, moving silently toward the door. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, approaching methodically. Emma quickly began gathering the scattered documents, while Elizabeth pressed the journal to her chest, as though trying to protect its secrets. Thomas reached for the light switch and turned it off, plunging the room into near total darkness, with only a faint glow filtering through the cracks of the door. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the door. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, no one dared to breathe. Then a familiar voice, terribly familiar, broke the silence. I know you're in there, Dr. Anderson called, his voice strangely calm and professional, as if announcing the next patient in his office. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about Sarah Wilson. And about Claire. The three of them exchanged glances in the dim light, fear and determination mixing on their faces. The past and present had finally collided, and there was nowhere left to run. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Thomas reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling slightly. The moment of truth had arrived, and with it, the promise of answers that could change everything, or cost them their lives. Thomas kept his hand on the doorknob, his heart pounding against his chest. On the other side of the door, Dr. Anderson's footsteps had completely stopped. The silence that followed was almost deafening. You have 10 seconds to open this door, Anderson's voice came again, still calm but now with an underlying note of threat. Otherwise, I cannot guarantee the safety of certain documents related to Emma's adoption. Emma felt her blood run cold. How did he know about her adoption? Elizabeth grabbed her arm as if trying to stop her from doing something impulsive. 5 seconds. Thomas looked at the two women, a silent question in his eyes. Emma nodded slowly, and after a moment of hesitation, Elizabeth did the same. 3. The metallic sound of the lock echoed through the room as Thomas finally turned the key. The door opened to reveal Dr. Michael Anderson, a man in his early 60s, with neatly combed gray hair and thin-framed glasses. His impeccably tailored navy blue suit seemed out of place in the decaying environment of the abandoned building. Good evening, he said politely, as if arriving for a formal dinner. His eyes quickly scanned the room, briefly lingering on the journal that Elizabeth was still holding. I see you've made some interesting discoveries. How did you find us? Thomas asked, his voice tense. Anderson smiled slightly, stepping into the room with calculated steps. You weren't the only ones keeping watch all these years, Mr. Bennett. Since Sarah started remembering, I've been keeping a close eye on any interesting developments. Emma stepped forward, facing the man who might hold the answers about her past. What do you know about my mother? About Claire? Anderson's smile faltered for a moment. Claire Thompson was a brilliant young woman, too talented for her own good. Just like Sarah, she didn't know when to leave the past behind. You were there that night, Elizabeth accused, her voice trembling with contained rage. In the lab. You weren't just a research assistant, were you? Anderson adjusted his glasses with a studied gesture. I was much more than that, Mrs. Parker. I was the link between the research and the investors. Your brother Robert had the scientific skills, but he lacked the business vision. It was my job to ensure the experiments continued, no matter the cost. What experiments? Thomas demanded. What was so important that it justified murder? Progress, Mr. Bennett. Development. We were at the forefront of something revolutionary. James Wilson was brilliant but also dangerously ethical. When he discovered we were speeding up the tests, ignoring safety protocols, Anderson shook his head with feigned regret. Well, he became a problem that needed to be solved. Emma felt nausea rising as she heard the coldness in his words about murder. And my mother? She was pregnant. A regrettable collateral damage, Anderson replied, his voice showing no real remorse. Claire was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Just like little Sarah. Thomas took a threatening step toward Anderson, but the doctor calmly pulled something from his suit pocket, a small gun that glinted in the dim light. Please, let's keep this conversation civilized, he said, casually pointing the gun in their direction. After all, we still have much to discuss. For instance, the whereabouts of the microfilm Sarah removed from the necklace. Elizabeth pressed the journal to her chest. How can you live with yourself? All these deaths, all these lives destroyed. I live very well, thank you, Anderson replied with a cold smile. The benefits of being on the right side of power outweigh any occasional moral discomfort. You killed Sarah, Thomas said. It wasn't a question. His voice was thick with controlled anger, and Emma shivered. Technically, it was a car accident, Anderson corrected, almost pedantically. Brakes are such delicate mechanisms. A failure can happen at any time. Especially when someone starts asking inconvenient questions about past events. Emma took another step forward, ignoring the gun. And now, are you going to kill us too? Add more collateral damage to your conscience? That entirely depends on you, Anderson replied calmly. All I need is the microfilm and the journal. Hand them over and we can end this night peacefully. Otherwise, he let the threat hang in the air. The silence that followed was tense, heavy with dark possibilities. Emma exchanged quick glances with Thomas and Elizabeth, a silent communication passing between them. Anderson watched the scene with the patience of a confident predator. Then, in a split second, everything changed. Elizabeth was the first to act, throwing the journal toward Anderson's head with surprising force for her age. At the same time, Thomas lunged forward, seizing the moment of distraction. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the small room, deafening in the confined space. Thomas staggered, clutching his left shoulder, but managed to reach Anderson. The two men fell, struggling for control of the weapon. Emma acted instantly, grabbing a heavy metal stapler from a nearby desk. Stay away from him, a new voice commanded from the door. Everyone froze. Detective James Morrison was standing in the doorway, his gun firmly aimed at Anderson. Two uniformed officers flanked him, their guns also in position. How? Anderson began, his calm facade finally cracking. Tracker in the car, Thomas said through clenched teeth, still holding his bleeding shoulder. I installed it after Sarah died. It activates automatically if I type a specific code into the alarm. Emma ran to help Thomas while the police were handcuffing Anderson, who had completely lost his composure. You don't understand, he snarled as he was lifted off the ground. There are powerful people involved in this. This isn't over. Actually, Morrison said, a satisfied smile on his face, it already is. While you were here, search teams were scouring your office and home. We found a very interesting safe behind a false wall. Filled with documents, photos, and a certain microfilm. Anderson visibly paled. Impossible. The microfilm was in Sarah's safe. What Sarah put in the bank safe was a copy, Elizabeth said softly. It's here in the journal. She suspected she was being followed, so she created a distraction. The real microfilm, she found out you had stolen it from the necklace years ago and kept it. Emma, still supporting Thomas, felt a wave of admiration for Sarah's cunning. Even after death, she had found a way to expose the truth. "The paramedics are on their way," Morrison said, noticing Thomas's injury. "We'll need statements from everyone, but that can wait until tomorrow." As Anderson was taken away, still protesting about his connections and power, Emma finally allowed the tears to come. Years of unanswered questions, of gaps in her story, were starting to fill. Elizabeth moved closer, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. "Claire would be proud of you," she said softly. "You have the same strength as her." Thomas, despite the pain, managed a weak smile. "Sarah would be proud too. She always wanted the truth to come out." The sound of sirens approaching filled the night, but inside that room, amid the blood and scattered documents, a sense of peace was settling. The past, with all its dark secrets, was finally coming to light. Emma picked up the necklace, which had fallen during the chaos, studying the intricate details that had started this whole journey. It was no longer just an antique piece of jewelry, it was a testament to her mother's courage, Sarah's determination, and the strength she didn't even know she had. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "Now," Thomas replied as the paramedics entered the room, "we honor the memory of those we've lost by doing what they couldn't, living, and making sure the truth is never forgotten." Elizabeth nodded solemnly. "And we make sure the right people pay for their crimes, all of them." As the night wore on and the building filled with the activity of the authorities, the three of them remained united by something stronger than blood, the shared pursuit of truth and justice. The necklace had fulfilled its purpose, uniting the past and present in a story of redemption that was far from over. 2 weeks had passed since Anderson's arrest. Fall had progressed, painting the city in golden and red hues, as the investigations dug deeper into decades of corporate secrets and covered-up crimes. Thomas, with his arm still in a sling, was sitting in his office, going through a pile of documents that the police had released. Emma and Elizabeth were with him, each absorbed in their part of the investigation. "The financial records are impressive," Emma commented, her corporate experience helping to unravel the complex web of transactions. Anderson had been receiving payments from a holding company in the Cayman Islands for over 30 years. "And he wasn't the only one," Thomas added, pushing a file toward her. "Look at this." The same company made regular payments to at least 5 executives from the old Wilson and Associates. Elizabeth, who had been examining old photographs from the lab, suddenly paled. "I know this man," she said, pointing to a figure in the background. "Richard Hamilton. He was on the board at the time, and he's still the CEO of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the true extent of the conspiracy. "Hamilton was the one who approved the illegal experiments," Thomas said slowly, connecting the dots. "Anderson was just an intermediary. The real power was—" A knock on the door interrupted him. Detective Morrison entered, carrying a thick folder and a grave expression. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, carefully closing the door behind him. "But you need to see this right away. We've finished analyzing the microfilm found in Anderson's safe." Morrison spread several photographs across the table. They were images of old documents, records of experiments, and Emma felt her stomach turn at the sight of the photos of the tests conducted in the lab. "They were developing a new kind of drug," Morrison explained, his voice heavy with disgust. "Something that promised to revolutionize the treatment of mental illnesses. But the side effects, they were devastating," Elizabeth finished, studying the documents in horror. "And they knew that from the start." "Exactly," Morrison confirmed. "But the potential profit was too high to abandon the project. When James Wilson threatened to expose everything, they silenced him," Thomas finished, his voice bitter. "And my Sarah spent years carrying those repressed memories, until she finally started to remember." Emma picked up one of the photographs, feeling tears well up in her eyes. It was an image of her mother, Claire, working in the lab, her young face focused on some experiment. "Claire discovered the truth by accident," Morrison continued. "She was cataloging test results when she noticed discrepancies in the data. When she confronted Hamilton, he ordered her death," Elizabeth whispered. "Just like he later ordered Sarah's death." Morrison nodded gravely. "Anderson confessed everything. He's willing to testify against Hamilton in exchange for a reduced sentence." Thomas abruptly stood up, walking over to the window. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the city, like dark fingers reaching into the past. "Hamilton needs to pay," he said, his voice heavy with determination. "They all need to pay. And they will," Morrison assured. "We have enough evidence now." The problem is, a new knock on the door interrupted him. His secretary entered, looking flustered. "Mr. Bennett, sorry to interrupt, but there's something on the TV you need to see." Thomas turned on the TV in his office. The news broadcast showed live images of the Hamilton Corporation building. Police officers and federal agents were entering the main lobby. The reporter, her hair tousled by the wind, spoke quickly. "Breaking news. Richard Hamilton, CEO of Hamilton Pharmaceuticals, was found dead in his office just minutes ago. Preliminary sources indicate possible suicide, but..." "Coward," Elizabeth murmured, while Emma covered her mouth with her hands in shock. "This doesn't end the investigation," Morrison assured quickly. "In fact, with his death, many of the former executives may feel more willing to speak. The truth will come out completely." Thomas turned off the TV, facing the group. His face showed a complex mix of emotions: relief, sadness, determination. "Sarah knew," he said softly. "She knew that one day all of this would come to light. That's why she left so many clues, so many paths to the truth." Emma approached him, placing a hand on his good shoulder. "She united us. Even after she was gone, she found a way to deliver justice." Elizabeth picked up the necklace, which now rested in a small glass box on Thomas's desk. The old silver shimmered under the setting sun, as if it still held more secrets. "This necklace," she said, her voice choked, "started as a symbol of tragedy. But now it's a symbol of redemption." Morrison cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "There's one more thing you need to know. Something we found in Hamilton's personal files." He pulled out one last envelope from his folder, handing it to Emma with gentle hands. "These are the complete records of your adoption, including a letter your mother wrote to you before she died." Emma stared at the envelope, her heart pounding. Thomas and Elizabeth moved closer, offering silent support as she opened the final mystery of her story. The sunlight continued to fade, casting longer shadows across the office, as Emma began to read the words her mother had written decades ago. Words that would finally complete the circle of truth and redemption that the necklace had started. With trembling hands, Emma opened the aged envelope in the quiet office. The letter's paper had a faint scent of antiquity, and her mother's elegant handwriting danced across the yellowed page. The afternoon sun cast a golden light through the windows, as if time itself were pausing for this moment. "My dear daughter, if you are reading this letter, it means the truth has finally come to light. I don't know how much time has passed, nor what kind of person you have become, but I want you to know that every moment I spent carrying you was filled with love and hope. I write these words in the lab late at night. James Wilson has just shown me the proof of the illegal experiments. Tomorrow we plan to expose everything. But I am afraid. I know there are powerful people who will do anything to keep their secrets. If something happens to me, I want you to understand, I fought for the truth, not just for justice but for the future, your future. You are the reason I cannot remain silent in the face of the evil I have witnessed. I've asked Margaret to protect the necklace. It contains not only evidence but also a part of our history. One day it will find its way to you. I know this with the same certainty that I feel your kicks now as I write. You are my greatest joy, my deepest hope. Forgive me for not being there to see you grow, but know that my love for you transcends even death. With all my love, Claire." Emma had to pause several times as she read, her vision blurred by tears. Thomas and Elizabeth stood by her side, offering silent support as she absorbed her mother's words, crossing decades of silence. In the weeks that followed, the investigation unraveled like a spool of thread being unwound. The truth about Wilson and Associates came to light in a series of revelations that shook the pharmaceutical industry to its core. More than 30 executives were indicted, and hundreds of families of the victims of the experiments finally began to receive some form of justice. Thomas dove into the work of transformation. His company underwent a complete restructuring, emerging as a foundation dedicated to promoting ethical and transparent research in the medical field. The first and most significant project was the establishment of the Sarah Wilson Scholarship, aimed at young scientists committed to ethics in research. Sarah always believed that science should serve life, not profit, Thomas explained during the foundation's launch ceremony, his voice steady despite the evident emotion. "This scholarship is our way of ensuring that her dream lives on." Elizabeth, with her years of academic experience, took on the role of senior advisor to the foundation. Her constant presence brought not only expertise but also a sense of historical continuity to the project. She became a living bridge between the past and the present, ensuring that the lessons learned would never be forgotten. Emma found her own way to honor Claire's legacy. Using her experience in the corporate world, she developed a series of programs focused on transparency and business ethics. Her lectures, where she shared her personal story, became highly sought after by companies and universities across the country. "Every decision we make has consequences that can last for generations," she would say during her presentations. Silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it's complicity. On a quiet spring afternoon, exactly 1 year after discovering the letter, the three of them gathered at the municipal cemetery. The sight was serene, with wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze and birds singing in the ancient trees. Emma had decided it was time to do something she had been postponing: visit the graves of Claire and Sarah for the first time since she had learned the whole truth. The necklace, now restored and cleaned by a specialist, gleamed under the afternoon sun. Emma held it with reverence as she knelt between the gravestones. The inscriptions, simple yet dignified, seemed to come to life in the golden light. Claire Thompson, beloved mother and defender of truth, and Sarah Wilson Bennett, her love and courage live forever. "You know," Emma began, her voice soft but steady, "I spent so much time searching for answers, trying to fill the gaps in my story. Now I understand that the necklace was never really about the evidence or the secrets. It was about connection. About a love so strong that not even time or death could erase it." Thomas, who had been standing a few steps behind, approached slowly. Silent tears ran down his face as he gazed at the gravestones. "Sarah always said that there are no coincidences, only encounters we don't yet understand. She must have known, somehow, that the necklace would bring us all together, even after she was gone." Elizabeth, who had been arranging the flowers they had brought, rose with a gentle smile. "Sometimes the greatest tragedies can lead to the deepest redemptions. You two are living proof of that. Of how love can bloom even in the most unlikely soil." Emma carefully placed the flowers between the two graves, white roses for Sarah, lilies for Claire. Each flower was a silent promise, a testament that their stories and sacrifices would not be forgotten. "What happens now?" Thomas asked softly, his gaze lost on the horizon where the sun began its descent. Emma smiled, holding the necklace up to the light. The intricate details of the old silver piece seemed to tell 1,000 silent stories. "Now we live," she replied with conviction. "We honor their memories by being the people they knew we could be. And we make sure their stories continue to inspire others to fight for the truth, no matter the cost." The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A gentle breeze stirred the freshly placed flowers, like a tender caress from the past. The necklace caught the last rays of light, its details telling a silent story of love, loss, truth, and finally redemption. Elizabeth placed one hand on Emma's shoulder and the other on Thomas's. "You are living proof that the circle always completes itself. That in the end, the truth finds its way to the light, just as water finds the sea." Somewhere beyond the veil of time, Claire and Sarah smiled. Their struggles, their sacrifices, had not been in vain. The truth, like the love they had planted, had finally blossomed into a garden of hope and redemption. As they left the cemetery, the necklace securely resting in Emma's hands, the sun cast long shadows that seemed to connect the past and present in an eternal embrace. The story of the necklace had come to an end, but its impact would continue to resonate through the generations, a timeless reminder that love and truth always find their way. Dear viewers, what did you think of this emotional story? If you were as moved as I was telling this narrative, don't forget to leave your comments sharing your thoughts. If you enjoyed it and want more intense stories like this, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. It helps us continue bringing impactful stories that touch our hearts and make us reflect. Until the next story.